So I can go like that?
Yeah, we're good.
Fine.
Oh, we just minimized down here.
Oh.
All right, well, welcome to, week number 5 or 4 or whatever of Monopolitical Thought. And so this class is kind of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. I'm really happy to introduce our guest talker today. Dr. Chris Lynch is a University of Chicago PhD. He teaches in, like only 50 miles from where I was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So I'm filled with some envy that he has the job that at least my parents would like me to have. I think probably for my kids' future, it's better that I'm here in Boise, but that's another matter. Chris is a translator of Machiavelli's Art of War, one of his 3 or 4 or 5 great books. And he's right now writing a book on Machiavelli on war and politics. So I think there's no better person to have here in Boise than Chris. The way we're going to do business is he's going to talk for a while. I have some handouts that I'm going to circulate. And then maybe after 45 minutes or so, then we'll have Q&A. Feel free to ask Chris whatever, like, you said this, Professor Yenner said that, you must be right. That would be great. Right? That would show that I've had some effect. And then we'll take a break after that and complete the prints with Professor Lynch's help. So please welcome him, and here we go.
Thanks very much. So I was asked by my gracious host, Scott Yenner, to talk about the significance of Machiavelli, which I understand as the meaning of Machiavelli in 3 senses. What he means in the sense of what he intends to have happen as the result of his teachings, but also in the sense of what the substantive content of those teachings is. And finally, in the sense of the meaning of Machiavelli, the name, the significance of the word Machiavelli. And I'll try to make some headway in saying how this third meaning relates to the first 2. That is, I'll consider how Machiavelli's reputation relates to the substance and the intended effects of his teaching. So Machiavelli is justly most famous or infamous for boldly breaking from all previous writers in this ringing passage from chapter 15 of The Prince. And it's the first passage that you have in the handout that Professor Yenner just circulated. It's entitled, "Of those things for which men, and especially princes, are praised and blamed." Most of you, I believe, have already looked at this passage, so we're looking at it again. And because I know that many have written of the subject of how to rule subjects, I fear that in writing of it again I may be held presumptuous, especially since in disputing this matter I depart from the orders of others. But since my intent is to write something useful to whoever understands it, it has appeared to me more fitting to go after the effectual truth of the thing than the imagination of it. And many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. For it is so far from how one lives to how one ought to live, that he who lets go of what is done, for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity. At least 2 important things are clear in this passage. I'll linger over the first one for a while. It is that Machiavelli is teaching not only that one must be prepared to deviate from moral rules, but that one must learn to be able to be not good, to learn to be able to be immoral, as necessity demands. Let me kind of push through a couple layers of progressively more adequate interpretations of this point. Here's one interpretation of this passage and this basic idea. You should act morally whenever you can. even though you must sometimes, and with regret, deviate from moral precepts. Okay. But, in criticism of that view of the passage, there are really no moral grounds provided in this passage or elsewhere in Machiavelli for the idea that the deviations are to be regretted. In fact, the passage counsels concern with moral obligation, what one ought to do or not do, really purely instrumentally, as they serve to gain or lose something in particular, that is praise. Okay, so even if there's no strong sense of moral regret and moral obligation, one must, in a more adequate reading, one must at least avoid these deviations, if only because they can bring infamy that threatens your state. Okay. But it turns out that the human conditions that he mentions are potentially so competitive, you must come to ruin amidst so many who are not good. One risks one's state to the degree one misses any opportunity to ruin one's own bad neighbors. Every ounce of energy spent on avoiding immoral actions is in effect energy spent on making oneself vulnerable to bad actors. Not only that, sometimes it's very, very helpful to have a reputation for vices, like cruelty. So the question really becomes, when should one be virtuous in the usual sense of the term, and when should one be vicious in the usual sense of the term? That gets to a third level of understanding of the passage. Necessity. From the perspective of necessity, what one must do to maintain and acquire one's status. And remember, this applies to princes especially, but the fact that it's princes especially means it's also human beings. He says men, human beings in general, especially princes, but it's true of everyone. So from the perspective of necessity, deviation and non-deviation from moral rules are equivalent. Necessity reigns supreme over any moral considerations. Kind of straight up tough guy conclusion. You got to do what you got to do. But this pushes us to another level. How do you know what's necessary? Okay. That then makes us recognize, oh, my knowing is what this is really about, and self-education to a certain kind of knowing. One's main attention must be focused on self-education. Learn, the word learn is in this passage. You have to learn to be able to be immoral. That's one thing you got to learn. In addition, you have to learn to use that ability and not use it as necessity dictates. And then implicitly, what necessity is. What cannot not be in whatever situation you find yourself in. Of all the examples of the kind of immorality we're talking about, I'll pick a military one, since that's one of my favorite subjects in Machiavelli. That's your second passage. Here he's talking about how Hannibal, the great invader of Italy and near conqueror of Rome, the person whose name is mentioned in Machiavelli's other great work, The Discourses on Livy, his name is mentioned more than any other name other than Livy, the historian he writes about in the entire work. He's a non-Roman. He's an enemy of the Romans, but he mentions him more than any Roman. He keeps his troops in line, even though they are made up of men of all different nations and are mercenary troops. This, the fact that he could keep them in line, this is in the middle of your second passage, this could not have arisen from anything other than his inhuman cruelty, which, together with his infinite virtues, always made him venerable and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. Notice there for a minute, we've got on the one hand his inhuman cruelty, and on the other hand his infinite virtues. Let's see what happens to those two hands in the next clause. And without it, his other virtues would not have sufficed to bring about this effect. Now, Inhuman Cruelty is numbered among his virtues. It's not quite as obvious in this passage as in an earlier, more famous passage about Agathocles, the Sicilian. Thus you're accusing. And the writers, having considered this inadequately, on the one hand admire his action because he's such a great general, but on the other condemn the principal cause of it, that he was inhumanly cruel to his soldiers. How very much this passage is about education in the ability to be immoral is made clear in the immediate sequel and its proper prequel, which you've got to look back for. For right after this passage, Machiavelli tells us that by being too humane, that's the opposite of cruel in Machiavelli's vocabulary, with his soldiers, Scipio Africanus, a great Roman general, lost control of his own soldiers. In the prequel, just a few chapters before this, we were explicitly put on alert to look to see just how much Scipio learned about being humane or merciful from reading a book called The Education of Cyrus. An implication of all this is that the first challenge Machiavelli places before us is in overcoming moral hesitations and qualms, and many other examples suggest the same thing. An otherwise cold-blooded assassin who Machiavelli talks about, who nonetheless quakes at the prospect of murdering someone in church. The ruthless Cesare Borgia, who I'm thinking you're familiar with at this point, who fails because he counted on the power of forgiveness. Someone who he allowed to be pope, thinking that if he did a good thing for him, the past wrongs he did to this pope would be forgiven by the pope. If you can't count on forgiveness from the pope, who can you count on forgiveness from? Another example is a bold invader who might have unified Italy if he had just dared to break a promise that he had made to the pope. As Machiavelli says in the Discourses on Livy, it is very rare and very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to be altogether good or altogether evil. And much of the great and admittedly corrupting fun of Machiavelli is following out all the complicated ways in which one must be like Hannibal. But I mentioned that there was a second important thing about this first passage. The consideration of it will take us out of the more political and moral realm, sort of narrowly understood, and get us to Machiavelli's own realm, the realm that, in which he himself is acting as a writer and a thinker. This is the second part of the talk. First part of the talk was Machiavelli's bold counsel. The second part is Machiavelli as founder. As if it weren't already pretty chilling to tell people to learn to be immoral and to use the ability as needed, it turns out that Machiavelli must be up to something much, much bigger. He presents himself as a new Columbus, a discoverer or founder of a whole new world. At the beginning of his other comprehensive, if apparently more traditional, book, The Discourses on Livy, he has two books in which he puts everything that he knows, as he says. He says the following, this is your third passage. Although the envious nature of men has always made it no less dangerous to find new modes and orders than to seek unknown waters and lands, because men are more ready to blame than to praise the actions of others, nonetheless, driven by that natural desire that has always been in me to work without any respect for those things I believe will bring common benefit to each, I have decided to take a path as yet untrodden by anyone. And if it brings me trouble and difficulty, it could also bring me reward through those who consider humanely or humanly the end of these labors of mine. This is toward the beginning of the Discourses on Livy. Machiavelli is here announcing that he himself is among, and perhaps even a level above, I hope you'll see or at least be open to by the end of this talk, what he calls the greatest examples. So he calls them that in The Prince, the founders of new modes and orders. These are the great political, or really civilizational founders, Theseus of Greece, Cyrus of Persia, Romulus of Rome, and Moses of the Hebrews, and even ultimately of Christianity. In The Prince, he says, This is your fourth passage. For since men almost always take paths beaten by others and proceed in their actions by imitation, unable either to stay on the paths of others altogether or to attain the virtue of those whom you imitate, a prudent man should always take the paths beaten by great men. We could spend a lot of time in this passage, but I'm just going to kind of hint. You might be able to foresee the game Machiavelli is beginning to play in this passage by saying to the ambitious, take the paths of those who don't take paths of others. What's the game he's playing? If you're really ambitious, you're going to say, no, I want to be like the others. Those others, they didn't have anyone else to follow. I'm not going to follow their beaten path. I want my own path. Turns out that prudence, for them, the ones who didn't have a path to follow, prudence itself is really the only guide, and it's that one needs to learn. Later in the same chapter, the overlap between his discussion of the greatest examples and his discussion of himself, that I gave you in passage 3, becomes more pronounced and even more interesting in the 5th passage. Those like these men who become princes by the paths of virtue acquire their principality with difficulty, but hold it with ease. And the difficulties they have in acquiring their principality arise in part from the new orders and modes that they are forced to introduce so as to found their state and their security. And it should be considered that nothing is more difficult to handle, more doubtful of success, or more dangerous to manage than to put oneself at the head of introducing new orders. For the introducer has all those who benefit from the old orders as enemies, and he has lukewarm defenders, not very strong defenders, in those who might benefit from the old order. This lukewarmness arises partly from fear of adversaries who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not truly believe in new things unless they come to have a firm experience of them. So when you introduce a new way of life, you have as enemies those who adhered to the old orders. And those who might defend you will be lukewarm at best. And this word lukewarm has a lot of valence in Machiavelli's Italian. There's literally a special place in hell in Dante's hell, for the lukewarm defenders of Christianity. So those who might defend you would be lukewarm defenders at best, since they haven't yet suffered for not following or benefited from following your new way of life. But what I really want you to see are the clear echoes of his words about himself back in passage 3. The words difficulty, dangers, and new modes and orders. They should leave little doubt that he's suggesting similar things about two different things, himself and these men as founders of altogether new ways of life. What are the old modes and orders Machiavelli must overthrow? Who are potential lukewarm defenders of his new modes and orders? The plot thickens a bit more when we recognize that buried in the praise arising from the virtue required for accomplishing this most difficult and dangerous task is perhaps counsel, which, if accepted, would, like I say, sort of get us into a new realm. It's to introduce new modes and orders, but maybe without putting oneself at the head. Get others to do the dangerous work. Look at the continuation of passage 3 in passage 6. It says, if poor talent and little experience of present things and weak knowledge of ancient things, and is this right? Does that correspond with your number 6? Okay. And weak knowledge of ancient things make this attempt of mine defective and not of much utility, it will at least show the path to someone who with more virtue, more discourse and judgment, will be able to fulfill this intention of mine, which if it will not bring me praise, ought not to incur me blame. So we see Machiavelli in kind of mock humility, saying, I'm not really up for the task, so I'll let someone else or some others who come after me fulfill my intention. I won't be praised, but I ought not to incur blame, which is to say, I ought not to incur blame, but I will incur blame. I know I'm going to incur blame. This suggests that he's concerned with managing his own praise and blame, managing his own reputation, just as he advises back in passage 1 to princes. And also that he's concerned with fulfilling his intention, and as we spy now, with getting others to carry on for him, after him. It's part 3. Grand intention and tough guy teaching. Now let's look at another passage in which Machiavelli speaks of handing over to others whatever he's up to. We'll not only find confirmation that he may be in earnest about getting others to fulfill his intention, that is to do the dangerous work he has set out for them, but you'll also begin to see just what that something, that intention is. At least we'll be able to see it negatively. Okay. Human appetites are insatiable. Talks about human appetites for a while. And I guess I'll skip that first part. That's interesting to look at. He's talking about, I guess I should give you context and skip that passage instead of give you context, and then I'll read the last part of that passage. And that is, he's talking here after he's gone on in one of 3 books of the Discourses of Livy. He divides it up into 3 books, and he's been saying how bad things are in modern times and how good they were in ancient times. And he says, boy, you know, people tend to do this, especially cranky old men. They look back and say, gosh, things were great before. They're bad now. He says, you know, maybe I'm off in that. He said, and truly, if the virtue that then used to reign and the vice that now reigns were not clearer than the sun, I would go on speaking with more restraint, fearing falling into this deception of which I accuse some. But since the thing is so manifest that everyone sees it, I will be spirited in saying manifestly that which I may understand of the former and of the latter times, so that the spirits of youths who may read these writings of mine can flee the latter and prepare themselves to imitate the former at whatever time fortune may give them opportunity. So now he identifies an audience, one that might help to overcome somewhat the problem of enemies who benefit from the old orders and the weakness of lukewarm defenders. That audience is the young. They're not yet as deeply invested in the old order, and far from lukewarm, they're generally red hot to improve their situations, at least compared to the fire, the dying fire of us oldsters. Not only that, the young just keep coming, generation after generation. And there his writings will be to greet them, until it happens that the teaching takes hold and can be put into practice. Perhaps a bit at a time, perhaps all at once. And in fact, he leaves advice in 2 different chapters of the Discourses on how you could put things into place all at once and how you can do it a little bit over time. Major reformations. But more to the point, he's identified the problem he's devoted himself to solving in both of his comprehensive books, the books in which he teaches everything he knows. That problem is the wretched condition into which the Western world has collapsed in his time, as compared at least to the vibrant strength of the ancient world. This is a really important passage in Machiavelli. It's passage 8. If my sequence ever gets off from yours, tell me, okay, so we can make sure we're on the same page. I believe it arises from the same cause, the weakness of the world is the it, how the weakness of the world's collapsed into. I believe that arises from the same cause that makes men less strong now, which I believe is the difference between our education and the ancient, founded on the difference between our religion and the ancient. The ancient religion did not beatify men if they were not full of worldly glory, as were captains of armies and princes of republics. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men. It has then placed the highest good in humility, abjectness, and contempt of things human. The other placed it in greatness of spirit, strength of body, and all other things capable of making men very strong. And if our religion asks that you have strength in yourself, it wishes that you be capable more of suffering than of doing something strong. This mode of life thus seems to have rendered the world weak and given it in prey to criminal men, who can manage it securely, seeing that the collectivity of men, so as to go to paradise, think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them. As with all passages in Machiavelli, there are a couple of layers here. One may, if one wishes, see the passage as nothing more than the expression of revulsion at criminal exploitation of believers by hypocritical priests. If one stopped there, however, one might say the real problem is the prelate's hypocrisy, and the real solution is to restore the spiritual and moral integrity of the church. And some people did conclude that. The Reformation was one such attempt. But Machiavelli's concern is different and deeper. The real problem, in his mind, is the lack of virtue, of excellence, required to maintain the exploitation perpetrated by the prelates. As Machiavelli says in chapter 11 of The Prince, these priests, quote, now you don't have this quotation, these priests keep their states however they proceed. They have subjects, but do not govern them. The subjects, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged from the princes, these priests, nor can they. How the priests manage this feat is a long story, but part of it is that, thanks to ancient Rome's aggressive military expansionism and consequent destruction of political freedom and independence throughout the world, the church came into being, it came into existence in what, to overstate it a little bit, but in keeping with Machiavelli, is a post-political world. A world in which there are no states. There's just one big world state. Another part is that the teachings and the structure of the church successfully manage human passions, indeed the passions of humanity as such, in a manner and on a scale that had not been attempted or perhaps even imagined by ancient political thinkers. Machiavelli's problem is how to return the world to something resembling ancient excellence without just setting up a return to some future date to the same kind of weakness. One element of the solution is to revive politics by reviving a concern with and an attachment to particular political entities. Another is to do so using structures and teachings that learn from and even parallel those by means of which Christianity has ruled the world for over a millennium by his time. Well, how to bring this off? A key element is in distributing far and wide all sorts of useful, tough guy advice on how to beat your enemies. Machiavelli delivers the lessons with singularly appealing panache, especially appealing to the ambitious. And his many wicked pieces of advice are what he's most widely remembered for. A big part of this advice is taken by most to entail a claim about human nature. Machiavelli places such a great emphasis on the viciousness of human beings that it is tempting to take the fact of human evil to be the fulcrum of his thought. Because human beings are naturally bad, it's better, or be better at being bad than the next guy, or be ruined. So he seems to talk as though men simply are a certain way, with the implication, never stated but frequently traded on, that human nature is fixed, that the nature of man is insecure, envious, greedy, and aggressive. Because of that, his thought follows. But this kind of assessment and related advice have always been around. Assessment of human beings and related advice. There have always been tough guys, and some of them have always been willing to go into the consulting business. So it doesn't seem like this would really break the lock of the church and Christianity on the people in the world, in part because the church and Christianity can always play their trump card by responding to this. Yeah, see, we told you the world is full of wicked people, fallen and evil, and in need of us. Right? So if that's the real basis of his thought, that human beings are wicked, it's really not that unique, nor is it in itself especially helpful in restoring human virtue or excellence. So I'm saying that the fact of human wickedness is important to Machiavelli's thought, just that it's not especially helpful in identifying the significance or the meaning of that thought. And a moment's reflection yields the recognition that he acknowledges the fact of human goodness as well. He discusses many individuals and peoples whom he considers good in the usual moral senses of kind, giving, grateful, and just. The real question is what to do in the face of all these human facts. The really important thing about human nature for Machiavelli is that it's neither fundamentally good nor fundamentally evil. Rather, the crucial fact regarding human nature is that it is, to a very considerable degree, though not infinitely so, malleable, shapeable. Insight into this malleability, greater in degree and perhaps different in kind from that acknowledged by ancient political philosophy. So insight into this malleability promises expansionism different from the military expansionism of the Romans that he studies. His is the expansion of what is possible for humanity. The claim that human nature is malleable would seem to be belied by numerous prominent Machiavellian assertions. Among the most telling is the one found in passage 9. It's necessary to whoever disposes a republic and orders laws in it to presuppose that all men are bad, and that they always have to use the malignity of their spirit whenever they have an opportunity for it. He seems here to contend that all men are bad by nature, to offer as evidence the fact that they spew forth their malignant spirits at the first opportunity, and to advise making laws to counter that malignity. Yet even if one ignores its immediate context, which I'll turn to in a minute, the passage clearly does not support such a reading. For Machiavelli here asserts nothing about human nature. Just go with the drift of the passage, go with the words. You always got to do both with Machiavelli. Follow the drift and see what the strict words are. For Machiavelli here asserts nothing about human nature. Rather, he makes a claim about what founders and legislators of republics must assume about human beings. In addition, the claim is not about what everyone must assume, just about what founders and legislators must assume. And not all founders and legislators, just Republican ones. Finally, to say that such founders and legislators must operate on the basis of a particular assumption in no way entails or implies a claim about whether the assumption is true, let alone true without any qualifications. Therefore, the most that can be claimed is that Machiavelli advises skepticism regarding human goodness in political life. Indeed, far from breaking from the ancients in this passage with this advice, Machiavelli seeks to emphasize explicitly his continuity with the tradition, for the entire passage is prefaced by, as those demonstrate who reason on a civil way of life, and as every history is full of examples, it is necessary, etc. And those who reason on civil life, that's his phrase for Aristotle. People like him, Cicero. He mentions Aristotle only once in his published work, his great works. He's very careful about not mentioning him, but he has him on his mind all the time. He thereby signals his agreement with the ancients as to how especially founders must orient themselves towards the givens of human nature. He begins to prepare his departure from them, however, by taking to the limit the moral skepticism contained in the advice that Republican founders must assume that men are bad. Apparently no longer elaborating on what Republican founders and legislators must assume, he continues, when any malignity remains hidden for a time, this proceeds from a hidden cause, which is not recognized because no contrary experience has been seen. Indicating that even when it seems that men are good, no matter how long this appearance lasts, one should believe that malignity is hidden somewhere, and that it is hidden by a hidden cause. He seeks to cultivate a hermeneutics or a methodology of constant suspicion. Machiavelli begins to appear not just as theorist of conspiracies, but as founder of conspiracy theory, as a way of life, as a fundamental orientation to the moral and political world. The emphasis in the wider context is not only on the badness of human beings, but on the efficacy of the customs, laws, and especially institutions that shape humans. This emphasis is most pronounced in the section of the discourses devoted to the character of the multitude, chapters 46 to 59 of the first book of the Discourses. There, Machiavelli explicitly announces his fundamental disagreement with all previous authorities as to the constancy of the multitude. So it's a great break from all previous thinkers regarding democracy, the people. A people, says Machiavelli, is seen to begin to hold a thing in horror and to stay with that opinion for many centuries. It's a quote from him. For Machiavelli, the people are the repository of morality and can be relied on for centuries on end to hold fast to a given morality. Such moral constancy would seem to tell against my claim that human nature is malleable, but only if one fails to pause to consider the moment at which, quote, a people is seen to begin to hold a thing in horror. We have to remind ourselves that Machiavelli is especially interested in such beginnings, the beginning point of when people come to believe something and then hold it for centuries. Not just those in which governments are formed, but great foundings like that of Moses, when a people did indeed begin to hold a thing in horror or awe, and then held fast to that opinion for centuries and handed that awe, that horror, down to yet another religion, Christianity, that followed it. So we have a minute to descend into the particulars of just what makes such moments possible. There are many means to facilitate such moments. The key to the surest, however, is to exploit to the full what Machiavelli calls the nature of the multitude. Christianity does this especially well. The multitude speaks boldly against its prince's decisions until, that is, each member is made to stare the penalty in the face, at which point they no longer trust one another. They no longer band together. Instead, they run to obey their prince. Therefore, one need not heed what they say, whether good or bad, about their disposition toward their prince. When together the people resist in speech, isolated by fear, they obey indeed. Time after time, Machiavelli's princes operate on this principle of manipulation. Furthermore, Machiavelli indicates that there is almost no limit to what princes of a certain type are able to achieve politically. A human being of rare brain and authority can shape any matter into a form opposite to its accustomed form, whether republic or principality. The people, when each is isolated by fear for himself, are putty, or better to say clay, in his hands. This extreme case reveals how very malleable human beings are, but Machiavelli does not leave it at that. He elevates a version of this extreme to the level of what can be called, following Leo Strauss, Machiavelli's truest truth, applicable to all men in all times. I don't think I put this in your packet. Quote, it is more true than any other truth that if where there are men, there are not soldiers, this arises through a defect of the prince and not through any other defect, either of the sight or of nature, either of circumstances or chance or of nature. Nothing's to blame for there being humans, but not soldiers shaped according to the prince's will. Machiavelli will accept no excuse from princes of republics or of principalities if they fail to shape men in accordance with the most fundamental necessities. But then why did Machiavelli encourage us to think the opposite, that because human beings' natures are fixed and bad, one must operate in a certain way? This is to raise the question of his own relation to the human matter he found before him and the possibilities he saw for it, the human beings at his time. He sought, I would suggest, to employ the principle revealed and used to such dazzling effect by Christianity, that together human beings resist authority, including reason's authority, while isolated by fear for themselves, they submit. He sought to replace the fear of God with the fear of human beings for one another. It would serve his purposes well, then, to promote the view that each of us is by nature out to get the others. And what better way to promote this view of human beings than convince them that things like imperial expansionism is a necessity, and then let the race begin. In passage 9, Machiavelli quoted the saying that time reveals every truth. He also says that Christianity has shown us the truth, and the true way. I hope you're now in the position to consider the possibility that Christianity showed Machiavelli that human matter could be changed by human beings and pointed the way to how. So the fourth part. How tough talk leads to a new world, or the paradox of the open lie, or the meaning of Machiavelli, the word. Now we've seen two senses of Machiavelli's meaning, his intention to replace a world ruled by fear of what is beyond man, and that takes all the glory of man for himself, God, by a world that uses the same passions of fear and glory and puts them in a new, purely human foundation, puts them on a new human foundation. Something's still missing, and getting at what it is will illuminate the third sense of Machiavelli's meaning, the meaning of Machiavelli, the name. A good way to see this is to perform the following thought experiment. What would have changed in the character and effect of Machiavelli's teaching if he had conveyed it strictly through poetry or drama, which he did write, but if he had left it at that, through characters and fictional narrations, or more simply, if Machiavelli had published his works anonymously, hadn't attached his name to it? Would it not have been as much as to say, you can gain safety and glory through immorality, but I want to hide because I'm afraid or ashamed? The teaching would, at least in part, cancel itself out. If it were published anonymously, it would not challenge the general climate of opinion that enveloped all social life. Indeed, it would have submitted to it and thereby validated it. It would have been another version, albeit an inverted version, of the tribute that vice pays to virtue in hypocrisy. It would breathe the air of the general climate of moral opinion even as it spoke the words of an immoral teaching. And it wouldn't pierce and puncture that general atmosphere or climate of opinion in which what we say and do must be justified in terms of the moral oughts of Christianity or classical philosophy. But now think of it as Machiavelli actually chose to do it. Write a beguiling, wicked, useful, intelligent, and beautiful work, and proudly admit authorship. Admittedly, after he dies. What did actually happen? Two things. Machiavel, in English, became a word that meant wickedness of every kind, but most especially force and fraud. His thoughts were taken up and transformed, sometimes with attribution, sometimes with heavy allusion, and sometimes with hints, sometimes with complete silence. On your sheet, I'm not going to go through these quotations. They're great fun. These are all sorts of direct allusions or references to Machiavelli in great thinkers: Shakespeare, Marlowe, Montaigne. Maybe I cut the Montaigne one, I can't remember. Bacon, Spinoza, John Adams. John Adams is the great founder who most clearly and at length read Machiavelli, commented in great detail on his Florentine Histories, his longest book. There's also a bunch of others: Galileo, Mandeville, Adam Smith, even Kant, certainly the Federalist Papers, Ambition, Counteracting Ambition. All sorts of either very clear allusions or direct quotations. I'm just going to leave that out there as Machiavelli wanted this reputation. He got this reputation. To be able to have the reputation and have this person be out there and be useful at the same time that he is known for this wickedness itself is an act. Itself has effects. Okay. So last part. Machiavelli as a reader. I've tried to at least begin to make plausible the idea that Machiavelli founded the moral, political, and even intellectual and spiritual world in which we live, at least that he intended to. If this is so, he understood in advance, as it were, us. And therefore, he understands us better than we understand ourselves. We now live in a world in which, for instance, you could do this in a lot of different realms, but a world in which when someone steps out onto the world stage and says, "Submit to me because God has appointed me to rule you," he's greeted with jeers, or modern-day pitchforks, or titters, or psychotherapy, or yawns. Other similar claims to entitlement to rule are met with similar resistance. To bring about this state of affairs, Machiavelli did a number of things, including, on the one hand, duping us by, among other things, letting us think that human beings are essentially wicked and that he thought they were, when really he thought that they could be shaped by open speech about how to be wicked. And on the other hand, generously giving us a clear paper trail of what he did. And we traced a bit of that trail today. And perhaps most importantly of all, in the process, giving us a great deal of guidance on something that I really only just alluded to, but which is of fundamental importance, and that's how to read. I gave you a hint of that in talking about how Scipio read Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, with the result that he imitated Cyrus's mercy, and thereby, in his case, ultimately induced his own men to mutiny against him. There Machiavelli acted, in that passage, at the point we glanced at his treatment of it, as though the fault was Xenophon's, the writer of the book that Scipio read, for writing up an imaginary principality. Okay, Cyrus, the Education of Cyrus is not of the historical Cyrus. He invents this whole character. But otherwise, he indicates that the fault elsewhere, and if you look at it more closely, Machiavelli indicates that the fault was Scipio's, at least in part, for being insufficiently careful or insufficiently wakeful as a reader. What this generosity does, Machiavelli's generosity of letting us see what he did in the way in which one must read, it allows a bunch of things. It allows us to see ourselves, the world in which we live, as, to a very large degree, a product of Machiavelli's doings. It can allow us then to partake of that project more knowingly if we wish. It can also make us recognize its problems and failures perhaps more clearly. It can also offer us a path which we can think ourselves, through which we can think ourselves out of theoretical difficulties that we thought were just how things are, and recognize, no, they were made this way by a person who thought things through. Maybe we can think ourselves back through that path and come out the other side. It might even give us kind of battle plans if we seek to oppose him practically with new methods or with methods we've learned from him. If we know what he was up to and want to counter it, we can do that. Whatever we end up doing with what we learn from him and about him, he has opened to us the door of his study in more ways than one. We are invited to see the way he came to understand us so well. And it was by understanding perfectly the great thoughts and deeds that came before him. About which study, let's look at these last two passages. The next to last passage in your packet, I think, is Machiavelli in a famous letter to Vittori, describing his typical day. I'm going to start reading with, when evening has come, I return to my house and go into my study. At the door I take off my clothes of the day, covered with mud and mire, and I put on my regal and courtly garments. And decently reclothed, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them lovingly, I feed on the food that alone is mine and that I was born for. There I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions. And they, in their humanity, reply to me. And for the space of 4 hours I feel no boredom. I forget every pain. I do not fear poverty. Death does not frighten me. I deliver myself entirely to them. And because Dante says that to have understood without retaining does not make knowledge, I have noted what capital I have made from their conversation, and I have composed a little work. That little work is, of course, the Prince, in which he continues and fills out this thought on reading. He continues in the Prince the same sort of thought. He says in the dedicatory letter, I have found nothing in my belongings that I care so much for and esteem so greatly as the knowledge of the actions of great men, learned by me from long experience of modern things and a continuous reading of ancient ones, having thought out and examined these things with great diligence for a long time. This sets the standard for any serious course of study, perhaps even more so in our time than in Machiavelli's. For when we read truly excellent books, we study most importantly the permanent problems of human life and of existence as such, but also the actions of great human beings of the past, by which I mean both the historical and imagined actions depicted in great books, but also, and in some respects, even more importantly, the actions of the writers themselves as writers. For every one of these thinkers made the fateful decision to write, which is always and essentially to act. I have tried to show that Machiavelli's action was unique in the history of thought in that he attached his name to an immoral teaching as part of his overall enterprise to create or found the modern world, hostile to divine intervention and friendly to human excellence. So I understand time for questions. I'm happy to take any and every. We're a small enough group, I can call on anyone who wants to. Yeah, and maybe since we're a small enough group, you could just say your name is...
Okay, my name is Mike.
Okay, Mike.
And first of all, thank you for accepting Professor Yenner's invitation to come. This has really been an enlightening talk. I've got to be honest with you, Machiavelli is quite a challenge. But what I'm getting at in the first part of what you were talking about, in your opinion, do you think he's sociopathic? I mean, by sociopathic I mean like CEOs and all that, it's successful people, that they don't consider people's emotions as useful. They're more goal driven, because you talked about how he said that necessity reigns supreme. Would that be a fair assessment of his writings?
I'm glad you asked that. You asked it in just the right way, so that I can say absolutely not. Because you said useful, you said sociopathic in that he doesn't regard people's emotions as useful. If sociopathic is regarding people's emotions as useful and only useful, then yes, he is. I don't think it is sociopathic though, right? A sociopath really is deaf to them, is blind to them, and doesn't feel them. No, Machiavelli is acutely, minutely sensitive to them, and the passions of fear and suspicion, envy, hope, and indignation are the ones that, when you trace those, and the desire for glory, desire for recognition, desire for praise. The necessities that I'm talking about are those necessities. Okay, and this is a way in which this really flies in the face, in a way, in everything that I was saying about human nature. I was saying how malleable human nature is. It's malleable if one knows how it operates. Okay? There are certain things about human beings that are just so. Okay? But there are things from a moral point of view that are good, they're bad, they're all sorts of things. We have a lot of desires. We have a lot of feelings. And you need to be very, very acutely sensitive to them in order to shape them. And I mean, it's sort of like a physicist who you could say, modern science and technology runs roughshod over nature. It destroys nature, ruining the planet, and so on. And there's a lot of truth to that. But modern science and technology has to be extremely, extremely attentive to and then submissive to those necessities, like the flight of an airplane. I mean, how does that happen? It conquers nature by submitting to nature in just the right way, so you can get a lift off. If you don't submit to how things are, you're not going to be able to do something that's never been done. So he thinks there are certain things that are fixed. They're there. We fear, we love, we envy, we hope, we get angry, we get morally indignant. They don't go away. He's very, very sensitive to it. So no, not sociopathic in that way at all.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Yeah. What's your name? Logan.
What is the meaning of life for Machiavelli? Like, you can be empowered, you can manipulate people, but why should you care if you have the admiration he has admiration of history, if people who observe history are idiots, he also manipulates just the
Yeah.
other and the poor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So what's he really after? What does he really care about? What if this is just a big game of mutual manipulation and sort of mutual admiration among manipulators for, having done this? What's it about? Why bother with that? I mean, I guess I give a couple responses to that. One doesn't really get to the heart of what you're saying, but it's the second one I hope does. The first one doesn't get to the heart of it. It stays more within the ambit of Machiavelli's rhetoric. And that's that he makes a very clear distinction between what you could call the vulgar worship of success and those who actually know what the best path to take is. Okay, so it's not just about success and saying, oh, these were the winners, and I want to be one of the winners, and now I'm a winner, and isn't that great, I won. Instead, he sees all sorts of people who failed, and he says they were right. He sees winners, says they were lucky. So I don't want what he's doing, even within just the rhetoric of his work, to be seen as the worship of success, and that's what it's about. It's about really knowing. But then, to really get to your question, that doesn't really answer your question. Your question is, well, so what? So you really know how this hall of mirrors of human life works, and you're able to operate within it. Machiavelli is really, this is a kind of a deep, you kind of got to, I'll be asking you to take my word for it, partly, but later I think we'll be reading, so maybe you won't have to entirely take my word for it, but Machiavelli is concerned with human excellence. He's concerned with human excellence, and that much you can see right in his works. And he leaves up in the air what that excellence is. And it's a very hard to get at thing. It's some sort of combination of excellence as traditionally understood and excellence in this Machiavellian sense of getting yours. Now, it turns out that really to be excellent, you must be a knower. You must know infinite things, to use his phrase. You need to know everything a human being can know. You need to know that God's not going to just zap you. How are you going to know that? How are you going to know you're not going to go to hell for being this way? You need to know. It would be foolhardy not to know such things and to act in this way. What Machiavelli does is he sets things up so that he says, I'll tell you how you can know how to win. And then it turns out that to know how to win, you basically have to be a knower in the fullest sense. You end up having to be a philosopher. It's a backhanded way, for a very specific reason, is it backhanded. It's a backhanded way of making a case for why the life of knowing is the best way of life without having to make that case in Platonic or Aristotelian terms, without saying, there's an order of the soul. There's a higher part of your soul and a lower part of your soul. You have to have the higher in charge of the lower. And then there's a best version of the human being that's ordered in that way. Not only is there a best version of a human being, and now we leave Plato and we go to the Christian tradition, there's a best being simply. There's a being called God. That's the divine version of the excellent human beings who we classical philosophers call philosophers. He wants to avoid that entire train of argument. Why? Because he's seen where it led. It led to, in his assessment, the destruction of human excellence in the world at the hands of a worldwide or nearly worldwide and an aspiration worldwide Christianity. He wants to make the case for human excellence without making the traditional case for human excellence. He wants to make you feel that you need to know, rather than to make the case that it's best to know. He doesn't want to say the best way of life is the life of the knower. He wants to first scare the crap out of you and secondly, give you great hopes for what you can achieve, and then set you on a path to do that that requires you to know a bunch of just tactical stuff, strategic stuff, but then bigger stuff if you go all the way. So that's what I'd say. So I mean, the whole phrase "meaning of life," that's a modern, postmodern question way to put the question. So I could be pedantic and go after that, but I get what you're getting at. What's the purpose of? What's the ultimate goal? What's it for? It's for knowing. Brian? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brianna.
Brianna.
So Machiavelli, like, from my basic understanding, is using the prince when he wants to kind of establish like a new, obviously new politics, new order based on excellence, his like definition of virtue and like necessity. But what form would that manifest in like Machiavelli's like your version? Like, is that an authoritarian regime? Is that a democracy, or just like a combination of all of it? Like what does that look like?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. It's a hard one to answer, but it's hard to answer because, well, I'll start off with a quotation from chapter 21 of The Prince, where he says, "Prudence consists in judging among the qualities of inconveniences and picking the less bad as good." Okay, so again, he's astutely avoiding saying the good is blah. Here is my, to use the words of the tradition, not of Plato and Aristotle, here is my ideal. Okay, here's my best regime. Follow this and approximate it as best you can. He's avoiding that, and he's even saying, you know what, there is no good simply. There is no good in itself. There's just more and less inconvenient. Okay? Prudence consists in judging among the quality of inconveniences and then picking the least inconvenient thing, given the circumstances, as though it's good, and go for it. So, that said is the broadest context within which to answer that question. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. Okay? And circumstances really should determine. And those circumstances include one's own ambitions, what one wants to do. But he's got a national monarchy as a model, and the Prince really focuses on that. Chapter 26 of the Prince shows him really touting that and kind of explaining everything in the Prince as being for the sake of forming an Italian nation state that mirrors the French and Spanish nation states, which are really taking off at that time. And he says how you can do it, what's good about it, but he also points out its defects. Okay? First of all, the moral defects of every single case for him, and he's relentless in pushing this. All regimes have some injustice to someone. The question is who? Whom are you going to be unjust towards? Are you going to be unjust towards the great, the people, the ambitious, the soldiers? Who's it going to be? Someone's going to get, to speak vulgarly, screwed. Okay? And if you're aiming for a regime in which there is no injustice, that's the tilting after the windmills that you ought not to be engaged in. Instead, you could do a national monarchy. You could do an imperial, expansionist, transnational republic like the ancient Roman. You can do a transnational, not a national monarchy, a transnational monarchy like the Roman Empire, which he was all for. He doesn't locate the corruption of the Roman Empire until way late. Okay? It's way after Septimius Severus. It's in the 3rd century, late 3rd century AD. That's a viable way to go, to have a transnational monarchy. A regional league of republican regimes where you don't arm the people like Rome did in fueling a expansionist republic, but you arm the great. You're unjust to your own people. You have a league of the great, and you end up being basically hiring yourselves out as a bunch of mercenary cities that go and fight other people's wars. There are a lot of different ways. Okay, what they all have in common is the thing about injustice and the thing about arming yourself. All of them require arms of your own. Okay? All of them require the ability of the political entity to defend itself. I said a bunch of fancy things about the big philosophic stuff he's up to, but there's a way in which he is very much about, very down to earth, have soldiers be able to, if you are going to have a political entity, it needs to be able to literally, physically defend itself on the field of battle, in an open field battle, against any comer. If you don't, you're relying on fortune. Okay, so that's common to all of them, and injustice is common to all of them. And that's why he's so focused on arms of one's own. Ends up becoming, there are higher levels of this arms of one's own. That ends up meaning knowledge about things. That's really being armed. If you really know how things work, you're fully armed. But it also means literally having an army that can beat other armies. And that's why The Art of War is the work he published in his lifetime, and when he attached his name to in his lifetime, it's how to form such an army at his time of about 50,000 soldiers. You got your hand up?
Yeah, my name's Tommy.
Yeah.
So he comes off as very anti-church, but he obviously lived after his death, so he can come out stronger. Is it more that he's afraid of being censored, or is it that he wants the reader to think and interpret for themselves?
What's the? I don't get.
So which is the distinction? Do you think he does it more because
does
he's
what?
afraid of being censored?
Does what? Wait
He
to.
comes off less blasphemy than what his actual intent is.
Oh.
Because he can, if you read into it and interpret it, you understand that he's more anti-church than what he actually speaks.
Uh-huh.
So is it because he wants your intent or your understanding, or is it just he was afraid of being censored?
I got you. Good question. No, I think it's both, but I think the Inquisition was a little different when he was alive than it became later. There was an index of books and so on, but it became more rigorous, and his books were put on the index, shortly after their publication. And I think he would have foreseen that was going to happen, and that's so much the better. He would say, that's great. That imprimatur is the one I want. So I don't think that's it. I think it's, and he didn't publish them in his lifetime because he didn't want to get killed, he didn't want to get hurt, he didn't want bad things to happen to him. He did publish some things, and they were quite, they were pretty extreme. He's got some things in The Art of War that are pretty extreme. He had the Mandragola, this play performed that's extremely racy, and not just racy. I mean, it's radical. But ultimately, it's for what you said. It's that he wants to make it possible for you to think the thoughts without thinking them for you. And that's the real way to corrupt someone. And you give them parts of it, but then you leave it to them, and then they've thought the thought. If you speak a blasphemy, people kind of go, ugh. Get people to think a blasphemy. They go, oh, that's kind of interesting. Ooh. Yeah. We'll go each of you, and then you. What is your name, the young man?
Austin.
Austin?
My question would be, what is morality to Machiavelli? You spoke a good bit about Machiavelli reveling sort of in his own infamy, being very proud that his name is attached to an immoral work.
Yeah.
But is it really the case that it's Machiavelli's position that his own works are immoral and he's proud of it? Or is he more so recognizing or believing that the popular Christian morality of the day is defective and replacing his own correct morality? Or at least how does he understand that?
Yeah, good. I mean, when I first gave a talk kind of similar to this that had the kernel of this about human malleability and human nature and morality in it, there was a mentor of mine in the audience, and he said only one thing to me afterwards. He just said, Machiavelli is not Nietzsche. And he meant by that I was really emphasizing how much Machiavelli is, sort of shaping humanity as such. And one could go so far as to think he's trying to establish a kind of new code, a new moral order, a new definition of morality. There's kind of a way in which that's true, but only kind of. I think he thinks morality is morality. When he says a good person, he means a more robust version than we generally mean a nice person. He means more something in keeping with the whole tradition, and he thinks it's a real phenomenon, and he thinks it's not really going to go away. Morality is morality. It's some sort of restraint or sacrifice of oneself for the sake of others and ultimately the community. He seems to think that that's going to continue. He may want to attenuate it somewhat. He may want to take some of the fervor out of the moral indignation and the piety that inspires much of it. But he doesn't, and maybe he's wrong to do this, I don't know. He doesn't think it's going to go away. His version of what virtue is a kind of combination of traditional morality with kind of Machiavellian excellence. It's a movement within that moral universe that operates within it as effectively as it can. Then you could ask that question in a broader way, and that was sort of as Logan asked it earlier. Well, what's this all for? What's his view of good and bad? And then that's when you get into his full view of excellence, and then really that excellence ends up having to do with a life dedicated to knowing. Okay, you had a question.
My name's Heather, so I have a question about the prince, because it's the text that we're studying.
Yeah.
So Machiavelli is the most successful or best prince, one that maintains the most amount of power for the longest amount of time, or one that gains the most acceptance and is liked the most by the masses, or are they the same person?
Yeah. I mean, he does think that in most circumstances, really the best thing to do is to stay on the good side of the people. Okay. And that is going to allow you, and you could think of it as in kind of a lower level advice, and you think of it in higher level advice. That's going to allow you, if you're just a Machiavellian in the sense of a Vladimir Putin, it's going to allow you to keep control for long if you keep the right people satisfied for the right. And I'm not saying he necessarily keeps they have basically a kind of oligarchy. So in a way, he really satisfies the great, first of all. But he plays the great and the people off against them, and he's paying attention to the humorous Machiavelli says to pay attention to, and he's keeping those people satisfied, and that keeps you, what were your criteria, in charge longer. And then you can take it up one notch and say, well, what if you want to kind of establish a legacy, and you want it to go beyond just yourself? Then what are you going to do? And you're still similar. You're going to want to satisfy whatever the most, and this kind of comes back to my answer to, was it, no, what is your name? Brianna. Brianna, a fuller answer to Brianna's question. A thing that's in common in all of his solutions is you need to satisfy the most powerful element within society. I'll use that word, even though he doesn't use that word, society. And he really does. He is, in a way, the founder of sociological thought by having the humors of the great and the people be the foci of his political thought to a degree. You're going to satisfy that strongest group. But it's not necessarily longevity, and it's not necessarily expanse that is the thing that he's after. It really is glory. So getting glory, being glorious is the thing that he's offering, the thing that he's dangling, the thing he's saying, when you do that, that's when you've really gotten everything you can get from what I'm teaching in the Prince. It's getting glory. And you are a little bit over a barrel on how to do that. Can you be Machiavellian and be glorious as opposed to infamous? And he says, yes, if you really found something great. If you keep it small, they're going to know you as, you know, a grand thug of one kind or another, a Putin. But if you keep it, turn it into something great, then glory is possible, and that he's really holding out. Now, I don't think he's ultimately beguiled by glory. I think he's most interested in the opinion of the most thoughtful people. But that's a different story. Yeah. Daniel.
It seems that Machiavelli's approach to politics is very scientific. Like his diagnosis of Italy being like torn apart, he says, you know, we don't have good ways of stabilizing it, maybe through ancient versions of excellence. We can, and it's very almost like Cartesian in nature. Humans are malleable, you can control them through your own will, bring about something good. But in the sense that Cartesian science it's not immoral, it's amoral. It doesn't attempt to answer questions of metaphysical nature. So it's like amoral in that sense, but if you apply that to politics like Machiavelli does, it becomes immediately immoral. And so why is that? Can you not? Is it immoral to manipulate people in the same way that science manipulates, you know, air to fly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that he's fully aware that human beings are different from matter in motion, and that he is talking about them as though they are matter in motion. It's like we're electrons with charges. We have love and we have fear, positive and negative. And the question is just how they operate in connections with others. He does do that to a very great degree, but he's also fully aware that we are purposive beings. He's suppressing that question of purpose. He's suppressing discussions of what's life for. When you get into the question, what's life for? You are down the path, the Aristotelian path of final causality and ultimate goods, and then ultimately the ultimate good. So he's avoiding all of that language, even though he knows we're beings who have purpose. We can't live without putting purposes for ourselves. We have to choose among our purposes and goals. And and in our relationships with one another, we can, to a large degree, make choices. And those choices will be experienced as, and he doesn't say that they're not, just and unjust. He doesn't say there's no such thing as justice. There's justice. If you return to someone, or I won't fall into different problematic definitions of justice, say according to Plato, I'll say if you give someone what they deserve, you're being just to them. If you do not give them what they deserve, you're being unjust to them. And he's aware that he's advising you to act in ways that run roughshod over that justice. So I guess it's because human beings are what they are, and he knows that they're that way, but he's downplaying that fact and messing with that fact for the reasons I said before. Yeah.
So my question is, so he obviously emphasized that he loves ancient Rome. He really says that Rome that he would be greatness. And then he also points out that Christianity introduces like this humility and these objectives that are like not bad virtues, just other virtues. And so like would he say like the reason that like, the Roman Empire fell is the introduction of Christianity?
Not necessarily, though that is a factor. But no. He seems to think that that's not the crucial thing. And there are a couple different crucial moments. There are really 7. I can't go through them all. 7 moments in the history of Rome where he traces really key, these nodal points where it went one way and it could have gone another. And one of those moments is when they have conquered all of their neighbors. There's no one left. There's still a republic at this point. There's no one left to conquer. This is after Antiochus and Asia. This is after the Punic Wars. Pretty late. Republic. That's when corruption set in for the Republic as Republic. Okay? Why? Because they no longer had to. Necessity no longer required them to reward the excellent among them. Why? Because they weren't going to be wiped out. The Gauls weren't going to come and conquer Rome. Hannibal wasn't going to come and call forth a Scipio, call forth a Fabius. They'd beaten everyone. So what could they do? They could start to let people buy offices and let slouches in who they don't really care. They're in charge. So virtue is corrupted in that sense. So Republican virtue goes. But it went on for many hundreds of years more. And then another one of these 7 key moments is when, in Machiavelli's assessment, is when they started to use mercenaries. They started to hire Germans. I mean, true mercenaries in the sense that they didn't come from peoples that the empire had conquered and consumed within the empire. The Germans at that point were outside. They hadn't successfully conquered them. They were hiring Germans to fight Germans. They were hiring Germans to fight others. And this happened. This was a precipitous. They went from, in about a 90-year period, the Roman Empire went from about 65% Romans serving in the military, their enormous military, to 1% in a 90-year period. And it's in there that the true corruption happens. Now, he doesn't give prescription on how you could do that and so on, how you could counter it, but he indicates how you could. So it's more nuts and boltsy, It's not like that you couldn't have continued even in a Christian dispensation, the Roman Empire. I think you could have for a long time, and he says that for a long time. It is true, though, that the thing about Rome, the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic and the Empire, is that it prepared the way for Christianity. It's really, the causality is really the other way. It's that the Roman Empire destroyed political entities everywhere. And that made it possible for something like Christianity, a trans-political teaching, to come and take over that whole world. So, and he's critical of Rome in all sorts of ways. It's really just sort of the first blush that Rome is the pinnacle. As the Discourses on Livy goes on, that's the book that focuses most on the Romans, he uses Rome against the moderns first. He says they're great compared to us. But then he starts to question them. And he starts to say, yeah, but they had problems. Number one problem is they caused Christianity. That's a big problem. If they're the cause of all the lack of virtue of his time. But then also the examples of the Romans as you go, they start to be the ones who are the screw-ups. They're the ones who don't get how necessity operates. And Machiavelli, and then the modern world that he's going to form. So it's a good place to start how much he looks up to them, but he doesn't uncritically adopt them.
Let's pause.
Okay.
Right, guys. So we've got 10 minutes. We have break out the donuts at this point, and but feel free to go buy coffee, and we'll come back and.
These are all gluten-free, fat-free?
What's that?
All gluten-free, fat-free donuts?
I'm sorry, I asked the orders last week, but I didn't get any orders. Are you doing that now?